Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 7. If you have ever seen an old clock working, like an old grandfather clock, or that sort of clock, then you will know that they often have a pendulum inside them, which swings from one side to the other. That is how they keep the time, and for it to work properly, it is important that the pendulum swings the full distance every time. Have you noticed that? It never stops halfway. It never stops a third of the way or 3/4 of the way. No, or at least it shouldn't. In order to work properly, it is important that the pendulum swings from one extreme right through to the other extreme. And it's because it goes from one extreme to the other extreme that the pendulum has often been used as an illustration for those times when people's views swing from one extreme to the other. Or perhaps in response to one person's extreme opinion on a particular matter, another person's views goes to the opposite extreme. In reaction against the one person's extreme, they don't come and stop halfway. No, they go to the very opposite extreme. And sadly, that appears to be what was happening within the church at Corinth. As we discovered in chapter 5, sexual immorality of an extreme kind was tolerated by the Corinthian church. And as we saw in chapter 6, sexual immorality of various kinds seem to have been considered, if not practiced, by some within the church. And so that being the case, how did others within the church respond on the subject of sexual morality? Well, now that we've reached chapter 7, it appears that in the case of some, at least, it appears that the pendulum has swung. It has swung to the other extreme. And they are saying, no sex whatsoever. No sex under any circumstances. That is what they seem to be saying at the start of chapter 7, which brings me to my first point, and that is verses 1 to 7. And there we hear Paul explain about the rightful place of sex within marriage. Now, if you've been with us during our series on 1 Corinthians, then you'll know that up until now, Paul has been responding to certain things that he's heard on the grapevine that were going on within the Corinthian church. He's made that clear in chapter 1, verse 11. He made it clear again in chapter 5, verse 1, that he had heard certain reports, and it was to those reports that he was responding. But now in chapter 7, he starts responding to certain things which they have actually written to him about. He has received a letter from him in which they have raised various issues, various concerns, and it's now those issues that he's responding to. And what you have in verse 1 is probably better to take verse 1 not as Paul's suggestion, but rather as a quotation of what they were saying in their letter to Paul. And just to make matters even more complicated, the NIV is not the best translation of verse 1. Rather than them saying it is good for a man not to marry, what some within the Corinthian church were saying was, ESV, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And so in response to the immorality that they saw all around them in society, and in response to the immorality which they saw in the lives of some within the church, their solution was to advocate a blanket ban on sex in all circumstances. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations. Full stop. That was their response to what they saw happening all around them. And it may be that this extreme response came about because, like the people at the other end of the spectrum, they too had a wrong view of the body. As we discovered last week in chapter 6, it was a low view of the body, which led some to say that what we do with our bodies is irrelevant. For them, spirituality was something completely detached from the body, and therefore you could use your body in whatever way you wanted. That was chapter 6. But now in chapter 7, we have people who likewise have such a low view of the body that they think their supposed superior spirituality has elevated them above what they considered to be the evil physical realm of the body. And their elevated superior spirituality means that they're prevented from pursuing physical bodily pleasures of any description, including sex. Whereas a low view of the body led some into immorality, it appears that a low view of the body has led others into asceticism. Our newfound spirituality is too great to get involved in anything as earthly and as physical and as bodily as that. And sadly, that has been a view that has characterized the broad spectrum of Christianity throughout our history. You see it, for example, in some of the things which the early church fathers in the first few centuries of church history, some of the things they had to say about sex, and you see it today in the demand for celibacy on the part of Roman Catholic priests. Following last week's sermon, someone told me that they don't ever remember hearing a sermon about sex before. The impression they were under, that they had got from the previous churches that they attended, is that it was the one word that you just did not mention in church. And so not surprisingly, the impression that the world has picked up from us is that the Bible and the Christian church is anti-sex. But nothing could be further from the truth. And we see that from verse 2 onwards, as Paul addresses the wrong view expressed by the Corinthians, and he explains the rightful place of sex within the marriage relationship. The right response to the immorality that you see all around you in society, says Paul, is not to ban sexual relations altogether, but rather to maintain healthy sexual relations within the marriage relationship. And therefore, says Paul in verse 3, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. When God created the marriage institution away back at the beginning of human history, it was clear that he intended sexual relations to be a key and a vital and a necessary aspect of that relationship. How else was the command to be fruitful and increase in number, how else was that ever going to be fulfilled? Do you remember that verse from Genesis chapter 2 that both Jesus and Paul go to for their theology of marriage? Genesis 2 verse 24, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will do what? Merely share the bills? Well, of course they'll share the bills. But that is not what defines the marriage relationship, is it? Some of you students share the bills with your housemates, but that doesn't mean that you're married to them. What defines the marriage relationship is that a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Right from the very beginning, God intended the marriage relationship to be a sexual relationship. And for those of you who are married, can I remind you that it is what you signed up to when you got married. And therefore, both husband and wife, health and age permitting, of course, both husband and wife have a marital responsibility towards one another in this respect. The sexual commitment that husband and wife make to one another on their wedding day is so great that Paul can go as far as to say this, verse 4. Did you hear what he said in verse 4? The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. And so, as Christopher Ash says to those thinking about getting married, he says, on your wedding day, you surrender authority over your body to your husband or wife, so you had better make sure you can trust them. The sexual relationship between husband and wife is one of the implications of that vow which we take on our wedding day when we say, all that I am, I give to you, and all that I have, I share with you within the love of God. And it is in the light of having made such a commitment that Paul says in verse 5, do not deprive each other, except by mutual consent and for a time, and so that you may devote yourself to prayer. Please note, such a pause in the sexual relationship must be by mutual consent. It must be for the specific purpose of prayer. It must be for a limited time only, so that we are not tempted through a lack of self-control. And perhaps, most importantly of all, Paul's suggestion in verse 5 is to be seen, verse 6, as a concession and not as a command. And therefore, this period of abstinence is something that a married couple may do from time to time, but it is not something that they're commanded to do. It is not something that they're obliged to do. And if they don't, then they certainly shouldn't feel any less spiritual for not doing so. To suggest otherwise would have been to play right into the hand of the ascetics in Corinth, who thought and taught that the less you engaged in sex, the more spiritual you were. Paul's whole point in these verses is to challenge such super spiritual nonsense. Within the marriage relationship, there is not a contradiction between sex and spirituality. Because as Paul goes on to say in verse 7, each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. And therefore, those who are married ought to see their marriage relationship, including their sexual relationship, as a good gift from God. Whereas the Bible forbids sexual relationships outside of marriage, the Bible encourages sexual relationships within marriage. I'll repeat that. Whereas the Bible forbids sexual relationships outside of marriage, the Bible encourages sexual relationships within marriage. That is the rightful place of sex within the marriage relationship. Moving on, verses 7 to 9. And here we hear Paul explain about the right of those who are single not to marry. The right of those who are single not to marry. Now, whether the Apostle Paul had previously been married and was now widowed, or whether he had never been married at all, is a matter of considerable debate. But from what he says in verse 8 of this chapter, it would appear that he was certainly unmarried at the time of writing this letter. And throughout this chapter, he will highlight, especially in verses 32 to 34, he will highlight what he considers to be some of the advantages of remaining unmarried. And it may be because there are some advantages that he says in verse 7, I wish that all men were as I am. But even if he is referring, and it's not certain, but even if he is referring to his unmarried status in verse 7, that does not mean that Paul has a low view of marriage or that he sees marriage as being second best. On the contrary, the Bible as a whole, from Genesis to Revelation, including Paul's writings, the Bible as a whole presents a very high view of marriage. And Paul himself has just extolled in verses 2 to 5 the blessings of the marriage relationship. But what he does say in verse 7 is that each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift and another has that. And within the context of this chapter, it would appear that Paul sees both marriage and singleness as being good gifts from God. And just as he will remind us in chapter 12, in relation to spiritual gifts, one person's gift, God-given gift, is not better or worse than another person's. One person's God-given gift is not superior or inferior to another person's gift, and that applies to these gifts of marriage and singleness. It is not that one is better or worse than the other. It's not that one is more or less spiritual than the other. Both are to be seen as good gifts from God. And that is why Paul can say in verse 8, now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. Well, as is often the case throughout this chapter, Paul is not issuing a hard and fast rule. He's not saying that the unmarried should remain unmarried forever. In fact, he goes on immediately in the following verse to highlight why some who are unmarried might want to consider getting married. And that is verse 9. If they cannot exercise self-control, then by all means marry, says Paul. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now please note that statement in verse 9 should not be taken as the sole purpose of marriage. The Bible has much to say on the benefits and blessings of marriage, and therefore it would be wrong to reduce the purpose of marriage to nothing other than a means of avoiding sin. That is not a very positive view of marriage, is it? The Bible as a whole portrays the purpose of marriage as being so much more than that. It is the God-given means of a man and a woman expressing their love for one another in the commitment of a lifelong, intimate covenant relationship. It portrays marriage as being the God-given means of bringing children into the world and the secure and loving context in which children are to grow up. And last but not least, the Bible portrays marriage as a beautiful illustration of that relationship between Jesus Christ and his church. And yes, as we have seen already in this chapter, marriage does provide the loving and stable and secure context in which a man and a woman can find fulfillment to their sexual desires. And therefore, if someone who is single finds that they're struggling to cope with those desires, then by all means, says Paul, feel free to get married. Addressing people, don't forget, who were insisting on celibacy for all, Paul is eager to emphasize in verse 9 that there's nothing wrong in finding fulfillment to our sexual desires if it is done within the right context, that being the context of the marriage relationship. But that in its own, says Paul, is not a reason why everyone must rush off and get married as soon as possible. If some who are unmarried are able to cope with their situation, as Paul apparently was, if they're able to see their situation in life as a good gift from God, then there's no reason, says Paul in verse 8, why they shouldn't remain married. Why they shouldn't remain unmarried, if that is what they desire. That is the right of those who are single, not to marry. And it is a right that we need to be reminded of. And I say that because within some cultures and within some churches, single people are sometimes put under enormous pressure to get married. Within some cultures, a person is considered to be odd or inferior in some way if they remain unmarried. And consequently, young men and women feel obliged to get married, and to get married quickly, even if they're not sure that they've found a suitable marriage partner. And what is true of some cultures can also be true of some churches, even here within our own culture. Single people are often not accepted as they are within our churches, or treated with the respect they deserve, and consequently they can be made to feel inferior. They can be made to feel as if they don't quite fit in to the church family, and that is a situation that is not helped by the rest of us desperately trying to get them paired off with someone. Such behaviour only puts people under pressure to get married. When Paul is saying here is that there's no need for single people to feel that pressure. If 1 Corinthians teaches us anything, then surely it teaches us that the one place that single people should feel accepted and valued and appreciated as they are is the local church. And that is true regardless of where that local church finds itself. Whether it be in, and I'll choose my places carefully, whether it be in Corinth, or Cardiff, or Calcutta, or Kano, or Kuala Lumpur. Well, I realise that there are some parts of the world where that will be more of a challenge than others due to the culture. But as is always the case, there are times when the church needs to demonstrate that it can be counter-cultural in certain aspects. And one of those is by recognising the right of those who are single not to marry. Thirdly and finally, verses 10 to 16, the demand for those who are married to remain married. Now, having addressed the unmarried in verses 8 and 9, Paul now turns his attention to those who are married in verse 10, where he says this, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife." And in view of what he goes on to say from verse 12 onwards about a believer who is married to an unbeliever, it might be reasonable to assume that what is in view in verses 10 and 11 is a marriage where both husband and wife are believers. Now, what we have to remember here is that Paul is not saying all that there is to say on the subject of marriage or divorce. Instead, he's responding to certain issues which the Corinthians have raised in their letter to him. And that's why he does not refer, for example, to that scenario that Jesus described in Matthew 19, where you may remember from our first scripture reading this morning, Jesus spoke of that one exception to his insistence on lifelong marriage relationships, and that's that Jesus would be in the case of marital unfaithfulness. Here in Corinth, the issue seems to be something else. It may be that some of the Corinthian Christians who were married were now so committed to their super spiritual celibacy that they thought it better to end the marriage altogether. They had become so ascetic in their understanding of true spirituality that they thought they should quit the marriage relationship altogether. But whatever the issue was, Paul insists in verses 10 and 11 that neither husband nor wife should do that, because marriage is for life. And although we distinguish between separation and divorce within our culture, and we usually see separation as a halfway house on the way to a divorce, that is not what the word separation means in verse 10. That distinction between separation and divorce did not exist in Paul's day, and both words used in verses 10 and 11 are basically synonymous and basically equivalent to a divorce. And therefore what Paul is saying is that neither husband nor wife ought to end the marriage relationship. Neither husband nor wife ought to end the marriage relationship for the simple reason that marriage is for life. That is the demand for those who are married to remain married. But then Paul is a realist, and he knows that in a fallen world, God's commandments are sometimes broken. And so what he says in verse 11 is that even in the event that one of them does leave the marriage, even in that event, then they should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to their former marriage partner. In the event of one of them leaving the marriage, he forbids them from marrying someone else, because having left one marriage to then enter into another marriage would, as Jesus says in Matthew 19, would be to commit adultery, unless, says Jesus, the reason for the breakup of the first marriage was marital unfaithfulness. But then what we also have to remember is that having recently been converted out of a pagan, unbelieving society like Corinth, some of these believers within the Corinthian church would have been married. Don't forget, this church is only about 4 or 5 years old. And so the vast majority of the congregation are fairly young Christians. And so what that means is that some of them, having been converted out of a pagan, unbelieving society, some of these believers within the Corinthian church, they would have been married prior to being converted. And therefore some of them would almost certainly have had unbelieving husbands or unbelieving wives. And it is to them that Paul now turns his attention in verse 12 and says this, "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord." Now, before going on to look at what Paul says to those with unbelieving partners, can I just point out that the way he introduces that, "I, not the Lord," that does not mean that these verses are just some things that Paul has thought up when he's been thinking about things. That little phrase does not mean that these verses are not divinely inspired, or that Paul is speaking with less than his usual apostolic authority on this occasion. All that Paul is saying at the beginning of verse 12, when he says, "I, not the Lord," all that he is saying is that nowhere do we have a record of Jesus directly addressing such a situation. And that is not surprising, because you think about it, Jesus' teaching was nearly always addressed to people of Jewish background. And therefore, when he spoke, for example, in Matthew 19 about husbands and wives and so on, he was speaking in a context where both husband and wife would at least recognize the authority of the Old Testament scriptures. Whereas here, Paul is addressing a different context where one partner in the marriage is a believer and the other partner is completely unbelieving, with very little, if no, religious background whatsoever. And even if they were religious, it was probably a false pagan religion of some description that they followed. To believers who find themselves in that situation, irrespective of whether they be the husband or the wife, Paul says in verses 12 and 13 that they must not divorce the other partner. Instead, they are to do all that they possibly can to hold the marriage together. And part of his rationale for saying so is verse 14. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. And so rather than the believer being defiled by the unbelieving partner, as some in Corinth perhaps assumed, the influence on this occasion works the other way. Did you notice that? Rather than the believer being defiled spiritually or religiously or whatever you want to describe it by the unbelieving partner in the marriage, the influence on this occasion works the other way. Now, can I emphasize that that is not a reason for a believer to marry an unbeliever? How many times have we heard a believer say, well, I think I can influence them for good? Well, this is not an excuse for a believer marrying an unbeliever. Paul will rule that combination out by the time we get to the end of chapter 7. Here he is speaking to believers who were already married prior to conversion. And to them he says that their presence in the marriage and in the home may very well have an influence for good on the lives of the unbeliever. Please note, Paul is not saying that the unbeliever is saved through the believing marriage partner. He's not saying that. But what he does say is that they are sanctified through the believing marriage partner. In other words, they are set apart. They are distinguished in one sense from the other unbelieving people around them in that they are now extremely privileged. Extremely privileged. And why do I say that? I say that because living with them is a husband or a wife or a parent who believes in Jesus Christ and who lives out the implications of the gospel before their very eyes, day in and day out. And that continual and constant witness to the saving and transforming grace of God places that unbeliever in a place of enormous privilege. Oh, it doesn't necessarily save them. To be saved, they will personally need to repent and believe the gospel as everybody else does, but it does nevertheless set them apart as being tremendously privileged, and that they are exposed to the life-changing effects of the gospel day in and day out in a way that other unbelieving people are not. And so that being the case, says Paul, to the believer in that situation, that being the case, rather than pull out of the marriage, the believing husband or wife in that situation should do all that they can to maintain the marriage relationship. They should continue demonstrating the grace of God and the love of Christ within the home, while at the same time praying that their unbelieving partner and unbelieving children will one day come to believe the gospel for themselves. That is the demand for those who are married, to remain married. But once again, Paul is a realist. And he recognizes that no matter how hard the believing partner tries to keep the marriage together, the unbelieving partner may come to the conclusion that they have had enough and so decide to leave. In that case, as Paul in verse 15, what can you do? What can you do? If the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. Because, as Paul says at the close of verse 15, God has called us to live in peace. And therefore, if our unbelieving partner is determined to end the marriage, if that is the determined conclusion they have come to, then rather than causing endless marital strife by rebelling or revolting against their decision, it is perhaps better, says Paul, to let him or her go. Because as Paul goes on to say in verse 16, how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Yes, you love them, and you pray for them, and you live the Christian life before them. But at the end of the day, you cannot save them. And so if they insist in leaving, then however sad that decision is, that is their choice. And, says Paul to the believing partner, you will not be held responsible for the breakup of the marriage in that instance. But please note, apart from that instance, the teaching of Paul is the same as the teaching of Jesus. And that is, marriage is for life. That is what we say when we take the marriage vows. Till death us do part. Marriage is for life. That is the demand for those who are married, says Paul, to remain married. Three things concerning marriage in 1 Corinthians 7. Firstly, the rightful place of sex within marriage. Secondly, the right of those who are single not to marry. And thirdly, the demand for those who are married to remain married.